When, on May 7, 1945, the representatives of the German Wehrmacht signed the unconditional surrender, the soldiers of the Luftwaffe also, figuratively speaking, laid down their arms. At its peak in November 1943, it counted 2,002,089 soldiers, including the paratroopers. In addition, there were 430,000 Luftwaffe auxiliaries, commonly known as flak auxiliaries, as well as 500,000 civilian Luftwaffe employees in various fields. But as it drew to a close, there were still aircraft, but there was a lack of pilots and fuel. Here in January 1945, with the burning Brabach hydrogenation plant, Magdeburg-Rothensee in the background, all the developments that had started around 1943, it had all been in vain. The surface-to-surface rockets, like the Aggregate 4 called V2, and their further plans, the surface-to-air rockets, for example the Rheintochter or the Wasserfall, here during a launch in Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea. The air-to-air rockets, like the Ruhrstahl X4 or the anti-ship guided missiles, like the Henschel HS-293. And the jet-powered fighters and bombers from the armaments company Arado, of which there were a whole series of impressive designs. Blom and Voss, Dornier, Fieseler, Heinkel, Ende der Zoom, Henschel, Horten, Junkers, and Messerschmitt. The prototypes of these already had the appearance of the models that would later be built by the victors. Then, since May 8th, the guns fell silent, and even the Luftwaffe of the Wehrmacht mourned its total of 138,596 fallen from the beginning to the end of the war, including 9,409 officers. 216,579 had been wounded, including 9,367 officers, and 156,132 are still considered missing to this day, including 7,816 officers. The German Air Force commemorates them with the Air Force Memorial in Fürstenfeldbruck. From the fighter force alone, from September 1, 1939 to the 8th. By May 1945, 8,500 pilots had fallen. Another 2,700 had been taken prisoner. The fighter pilots had destroyed around 70,000 enemy aircraft in the air or on the ground, with their own losses amounting to 38,977 planes, mainly Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters. 104 German fighter pilots had shot down more than 100 enemy aircraft each, achieving a total of around 15,400 aerial victories. One of the reasons why the German pilots achieved such outstanding victory numbers compared to all others was that they had to keep flying until they were either killed, seriously wounded, or shot down and taken prisoner. This happened more and more often towards the end of the war, when the Allied pilots had absolute air superiority. However, since internationally a pilot is considered an ace if he has 5 or more kills, it can be assumed that around 5,000 German fighter pilots achieved this status during World War II. Before I move on to the most successful German pilots of each branch of service, let's take a look at the top flying aces of the other warring nations. Of all the non-German flying aces, the Finnish sergeant Ilmarij Utilainen, born in 1914, leads with 94 confirmed victories in 437 missions. He scored these kills during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and in World War II. Utilainen was never shot down and lived until 1999. In the Japanese Air Force, the top scorer with 87 aerial victories is the naval aviator Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, born in 1920, who on October 26, 1944, after the transport plane carrying him and other pilots was shot down over the Philippines, resulting in the death of all on board, he was posthumously promoted to lieutenant. The leading ace of the Soviet Union is Major Ivan Nikitovich Koshidub, born in 1920 and a three-time hero of the Soviet Union, who achieved 62 confirmed aerial victories in 120 dogfights during 326 missions starting in 1942. Koshidub lived until 1991. In 1985, he was promoted to Marshal of Aviation, immortalized with monuments, and honored with a postage stamp in 2000. In Great Britain, the South African who flew for the Royal Air Force and was born in 1914, Marmaduke Thomas St. John Paddle, known as Pet Paddle, leads with at least 51, maybe even a few more, against Italian and German aircraft. Paddle was killed on the 20th Fahrtolfeitburen. He was killed in aerial combat against a German Me-110 in the Greater Athens area on April 20, 1981. With at least 40 at most, 44 aerial victories, the most successful Croatian pilot was Mato Dukovac, born in 1918, who held the rank of captain at the end of the war. After the Axis powers invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, he joined the Air Force of the independent state of Croatia, and then the German Luftwaffe. Here is his Messerschmitt Bf 109, with which he flew combat missions on the Eastern Front until March 1944. Later, after a turbulent life, among other things, in 1944 he deserted to the USSR, then went to Italy, later to Syria, emigrated to Canada, started a family there, and passed away in Toronto in 1990. With at least 40 confirmed kills of Japanese aircraft, the most successful fighter pilot of the United States Army Air Forces, as the American Air Force was called during World War II, was Richard Ira Bong, who was born in 1920. The major, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, died on the 6th August 1945 during a test flight with a Lockheed P-80 when the fuel pump of his aircraft failed and his parachute did not open due to the low altitude. His aircraft crashed at an intersection in North Hollywood, a district of Los Angeles in California. Bong is inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, a memorial for American flying aces. Italy's flying ace, with 23 aerial victories, is Sergeant Teresio Vittorio Martinoli, born in 1917, who was awarded, among other honors, the Iron Cross Second Class. After shooting down a number of Allied aircraft in Africa, after Italy switched to the side of the Allies on the 8th. On September 8, 1943, he joined the so-called co-belligerent Italian Air Force, here is their insignia, and from then on flew missions against the German Luftwaffe. Martinoli died in a training accident on the 25th August 1944 with a Bell P-39 at the Campo Vesuvio airfield. Now I will talk about the most successful German pilots of each branch of the Luftwaffe. Here is the pilot's badge. The most successful night fighter, with 121 bomber kills in 164 combat missions, was the 23-year-old Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, since the 16th October 1944, the 21st. Recipient of the Oak Leaves with Swords and Diamonds to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer died in 1950 in a traffic accident in France that was not his fault. On this occasion, I would like to remember the most prominent former member of the night fighter force, the Luftwaffe Lieutenant Walter Scheel, who after the war became an FDP politician, and from 1974 to 1979 was the President of the Federal Republic of Germany. Scheel was not a pilot, but during the Second World War, starting in the summer of 1943, he served in Night Fighter Wing 1, among other roles as the adjutant to the commander of the 3rd Group, and according to one source, he was also deployed as a radar operator on a night fighter of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 type. In the so-called day fighter force, the most successful pilot is considered to be Oberleutnant Herbert Rollwager, born in 1916, who is referred to in other sources as Hauptmann, here still as Oberfeldwebel, and a recipient of the Oak Leaves. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, with 102 aerial victories, including 44 bombers. Other sources cite the number of aerial victories as between 75 and 80. Here is his Messerschmitt Bf-109 in January 1944. Rollwager was injured on January 4, 1980 at the age of 63. In the African theater, Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Marseille, born in December 1919, recorded 388 combat missions and 158 aerial victories. As the 4th recipient, he was awarded the Oak Leaves with swords and diamonds to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on September 2, 1942. Only 28 days later, he was, at that time, the youngest captain in the Luftwaffe at 22 years old. He died in a crash when, while exiting his aircraft, which had become unfit to fly due to a technical defect, he was struck by the tailplane. The most aerial victories with the first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262, were achieved by Oberleutnant Kurt Welter, born in 1916, who was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Although he participated in only, quote-unquote, 93 combat missions, he was able to score a victory in 63 of them, including 56 during night missions and 25 while flying the jet fighter against Allied bomber formations. Welter died in 1949 in an accident at a railroad crossing in Lech, Schleswig-Holstein, through no fault of his own. The pilot with the most kills in a single mission, a total of 13, was Major Erich Rudorfer, born in 1917, who was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. In addition, with 222 aerial victories, he is the 7th most successful fighter pilot of all time. Rudorfer died on April 8, 2016, at the age of 98. The pilot with the most kills in a single day, a total of 18, was Hauptmann Emil Lang, born in 1919, who was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Lang was killed in aerial combat over Belgium on September 3, 1944, in his Focke-Wulf 190A8. Also remarkable is the unique achievement of Lieutenant Günter Scheel, born in 1921, who was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, who achieved 71 aerial victories in 70 missions on the Eastern Front, meaning he had more victories than missions. There are several versions regarding his fate during Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, on July 16, 1943. The loss report stated, Lieutenant Scheel took off at 7:07 together with the 3rd Squadron of the 1st Group of Fighter Wing 54, which was supposed to provide fighter cover for a Stuka formation near Orel. After completing this mission, Lieutenant Scheel shot down 2 enemy fighters on the return flight. During the second battle, his 71st, his left wing struck the enemy aircraft. The wing broke off at the fuselage, and his aircraft lost altitude rapidly from 800 meters. At 50 meters altitude, the aircraft caught fire and exploded upon impact in grid square 64,356 at 8:06. Crash site, about 15 kilometers northeast of Bolchow. In contrast, the German air war historian Ernst Obermeier writes that he possibly bailed out from 200 meters and landed behind enemy lines. According to another report, Scheel was allegedly seen in a camp in Jelabuga in 1946 and received medical treatment in a camp in Solny in 1948. Officially, however, Scheel is still considered missing in action. For most of those just mentioned who had survived the war, as well as the thousands of other former pilots of the German Air Force in World War II, a period of captivity as prisoners of war now began. However, this experience differed dramatically depending on whether they were held by the Western Allies or their Soviet ally. But hadn't the United States and Great Britain supported their former ally, the Soviet Union, during the war, not only with huge amounts of material? And after Germany's surrender, wasn't Stalin treated generously? Large parts of the territories previously conquered by the Western powers were handed over to him. In Germany, this occurred from the 1st to the 4th. From July 1st to 4th, 1945, the territories handed over were Western Mecklenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, Thuringia, and Western Saxony. Thus, the Western euphoria, under the naive motto, "The Soviet Union is just a slightly different democracy," quickly gave way to disillusionment. Because instead of liberating the Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Albania, as they had claimed in their propaganda, they had occupied these countries and forced communist governments upon them or supported those that had already established themselves. Now, to be able to face the overwhelming superiority of the armed forces of the former ally, now the enemy of the West. For comparison, the Federal Republic of Germany appears in green. As shown, the Western Allies founded NATO in 1949 with a more or less unified military command structure. The Soviet Union responded to this by signing the Warsaw Pact Defense Treaty with 7 of its satellite states, forming the Warsaw Pact. But since, despite the NATO treaty, the Western forces were so vastly outnumbered in the heart of Europe, the United States and Great Britain in particular threw all previous reservations overboard and now demanded rapid German rearmament, albeit under their permanent control. And after the Paris Agreements on the 5th May 1955, the occupation statute was lifted and the Federal Republic of Germany was granted partial sovereignty. Did the plans for establishing the new Wehrmacht, as it was still called in government circles, become concrete? So it happened on November 12, 1955, the 200th Sitturm, birthday of the great army reformer, General Gerhard von Scharnhorst. For the founding of the Bundeswehr, in which the Air Force was planned, with 180 reconnaissance aircraft, 279 attack aircraft, and 372 fighter jets. And for the most part, it was supposed to be subordinated to the army. To formulate an establishment order on paper was one thing, but to practically conjure an air force out of thin air was another. With all the burdens of the lost war and the close ties of this branch's leadership to the representatives of the Third Reich was another. Because first, enough Air Force officers had to be found who were willing, now under completely different circumstances, as part of a NATO Air Force, to use their experience, which had abruptly ended in 1945 for the new Air Force. Especially since, for many questions, you could only rely on the answers provided by the Allies. For example, regarding the duration of peacetime training, for example, for a jet fighter pilot, or what is needed in terms of infrastructure and technology, or the costs, and finally, where the instructors are supposed to come from. For all these questions, the so-called blank office, established in Bonn in October 1950, was responsible. It was the predecessor of the Federal Ministry of Defense, named after its head, the first Minister of Defense, Theodore Blank, pictured in the center. But, as can be seen from the official diary written in 1955/56 by the former Wehrmacht Air Force captain and Lieutenant General of the Federal Air Force, Walter Krupinski, did General Ulrich den Bezier write about the completely overwhelmed former reserve captain and post-war Christian trade unionist Blank? We painfully missed his previous charisma and power of persuasion. His political life goal? coming from the trade union to go down in history as the first successful Minister of Defense of the Federal Republic of Germany and creator of its armed forces, led him into increasing dependence on Adenauer. In the end, he also submitted to decisions that he himself did not think were right. This blank office, initially housed in the König Museum in Bonn, then in the Karl Barracks, now looked at the list of flying aces who had survived and were willing to appear before the so-called Personnel Review Committee, which was set up with representatives of all parties and mostly consisted of people who had been persecuted or resistance fighters in the Third Reich. But as soon as people could apply, a wild scramble for positions, classifications, and promotions began. In this process, one person in particular, who later rose to the very top in the Bundesluftwaffe, showed character weaknesses. And Krupinski describes how the selection process in this committee took place as follows. In this context, it was probably especially Chancellor Adenauer's close confidant, the head of the Personnel Department in the Federal Ministry of Defense, the staunch Catholic jurist Karl Gumbel, bearer of the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Pope Sylvester, who exerted a harmful influence. You hear great things about the Personnel Department. Hoppe said on Saturday that Mr. Gumbel not only checks the divorce files and the religious affiliation, but also carefully calculates whether the first child was born 9 months after the wedding. Great! The Catholic reactionaries are on the march. According to the wishes of the blank office, former fighter pilot General Adolf Galland was to be appointed lieutenant general at the age of 32 in April 1944 and become the first inspector of the newly established Federal Air Force. But Galland, who on the 28th January 1942 was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds as the second recipient. After 2 years of British captivity, served as an Air Force advisor to Argentine President Perón from 1948 to 1955, who, however, was strongly opposed by the Americans. When, after Galland's return to Germany, they learned of the plans of the blank office, General Nathan Twining, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, sent a secret telegram to General William H. Tanner, the commander of the United States Air Forces in Europe. It listed his accusations regarding Galland's previous activities in Argentina, his alleged, quote, strong neo-Nazi tendencies, and, quote, connections to prominent neo-Nazis such as his former fellow pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel. Twining had instructed Tanner to inform the German government that, while the United States confirmed that military appointments were made exclusively by the Germans, they disapproved of Galland as inspector of the German Air Force. This made it impossible for Galland to serve in the new Air Force. According to a later assumption made by a historian from the U.S. Military History Research Office, the reason for the rejection was probably that the Americans attributed Galland's rapid promotions more to his connection with Hitler than to his merits. However, this did not correspond to the facts. I just mentioned the name Hans Ulrich Rudel. This former colonel of the Luftwaffe was, as of the 29th December 1944, the only recipient of the Golden Oak Leaves, with swords and diamonds to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, making him the most highly decorated soldier of the German Wehrmacht. Rudel, who had been wounded 5 times, had flown 2,530 combat missions. With his Junkers Ju-8787G, the so-called Cannon Bird, which had been converted into a flying tank destroyer with a 37mm cannon, and later with an even more heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190. As a ground attack pilot, he destroyed 3 Soviet ships, about 70 landing craft, and 519 tanks, as well as over 800 land vehicles, more than 150 anti-aircraft, and anti-tank positions, 4 armored trains, numerous bunkers, bridges, and supply lines. As someone calculated, he had flown over 1 million kilometers for this, dropped around 1,000 tons of bombs, fired 1 million rounds of machine gun ammunition, 150,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition, and 5,000 rounds of 37mm ammunition. At the end of the war, Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, here seen disembarking from the aircraft, surrendered to the 405th Fighter Group in the 9th. He surrendered to the U.S. Air Force and was released from captivity in 1946. In the video, you can see him with other captured German flying aces, including Adolf Galland. But Rudel was not only an exceptionally brave and successful flying officer who had been shot down 30 times by anti-aircraft and infantry weapons, but always managed to save himself, and who even continued to fly after the amputation of his right lower leg and with an unhealed leg stump, but was also still committed to National Socialist ideology. In 1948, Rudel emigrated to Argentina, here together with the former Lieutenant Colonel Werner Baumbach, who is standing on the left in the picture, as the first ground attack pilot on October 16. August 1902 was awarded the Oak Leaves with swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, and General, retired, Adolf Galland is on the right. In Argentina, here together with the Argentine President Juan Perón on the right, Rudel founded the so-called Kameradenwerk, which, among other things, provided financial support to the families of those convicted as war criminals. He also worked as a military advisor in several South American countries. Then, since 1953, back in the Federal Republic, Rudel was the unsuccessful top Bundestag candidate for the strongly right-wing German Reich Party. All these incriminating activities, along with several others, had already made possible appointment to the planned West German Air Force impossible from the outset, and didn't even let him make it into even the remotest consideration. The most highly decorated German soldier of World War II, Colonel, retired, Hans Ulrich Rudel, died on the 18th December 1982 at the age of 66. Among the former pilots who were willing to help build the German Air Force, and who had also been cleared by the Personnel Review Committee, there were 4 officers who held the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 23rd places on the list of fighter aces with the highest number of kills in the history of aerial combat. But the choice for the first Inspector General did not fall on any of the fighter aces, but rather on the one who had held the position since the 6th, Lieutenant General Joseph Kammhuber, who had been entrusted with the leadership of the Air Force Department in the Federal Ministry of Defense since June 6, 1956. During the war, starting in August 1941, he had established the first successful air defense system as General of Night Fighters, the so-called Kammhuber Line, and now, since the 1st June 1957, he headed the West German Air Force as inspector. Knight's Cross recipient Kammhuber, born in 1896, had been in American captivity until 1948, and afterwards he wrote a series of monographs for the U.S. Army Historic Division about the conduct of the German air defense against the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces. As a close friend of Franz Josef Strauss since the 16th Fadenfreunds, on October 16, 1956, as the successor to Theo Blank in the office of Minister of Defense, the Upper Bavarian Kammhuber was appointed on June 1st. He was appointed Inspector of the German Air Force on June 1, 1957. He built up the German Air Force from scratch, following the model of the U.S. Air Force, and together with Strauss, he was also responsible for the multi-billion, scandal-ridden procurement of 916 F-104G starfighter jets. Of these, 269 crashed in the following years, resulting in the deaths of 108 German and 8 American pilots. To honor Kammhuber's achievements in building up the Air Force, Minister Strauss promoted him in May 1961, making him to this day the only inspector of a branch of the armed forces to become a 4-star general. Kamhuber left the Bundeswehr in September 1962 and passed away on January 25, 1986.
86.
He was succeeded as Inspector of the Air Force on October 1, 1962 by Lieutenant General Werner Panitzky. He had opposed the procurement of the Starfighter from the very beginning. In a 1966 interview, Panitzky once again confirmed that the procurement of this fighter aircraft was a purely political decision made under pressure from the Americans, which was indeed an accurate observation, but it was not appreciated in the politically run Ministry of Defense. General Panitzky was therefore, according to the CDU Minister of Defense Kai-Uwe von Hassel, quote, released at his own request on the 25th Defeat-Phone. August 1966, retired. After Lieutenant General Panitzky came Johannes Steinhoff, recipient of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords. With 176 aerial victories, he ranked 23rd among all fighter pilots in history. Colonel Obersteinhoff crashed with his Me-202 on April 18, 1945, with the aircraft immediately bursting into flames. After the war, he spent 2 years in hospitals and underwent reconstructive surgery on his burned face. Since 1952, he worked as an Air Force planner in the blank office, and in 1955, he joined the German Air Force as a colonel, quickly rising to the rank of brigadier general. As an expert in Air Force planning, he rose to lieutenant general and chief of staff and deputy commander of the Allied Air Forces Central Europe by 1965. However, Steinhoff's entry had not been without difficulties, because, as can be seen from the diary of Walter Krupinski, who ranks 16th with 197 aerial victories, there were serious concerns for various reasons about Steinhoff's re-employment. Demands from former superiors and comrades were made, quote, if at all, then only if it is ensured that he never leads a flying unit again. In the end, Steinhoff was accepted by the full committee, but in a completely unusual way, only after being reviewed by just 2 members. 16 years later, on September 2, 1966, he was then appointed inspector of the German Air Force, but throughout his entire post-war career, he never led a flying unit. During his time in this position until December 31, 1970, however, through analysis and strong demands on both the political and military leadership of the ministry, he managed to overcome the so-called, already mentioned, Starfighter crisis. On April 1, 1971, Steinhoff was promoted to general and appointed chairman of the NATO Military Committee, the highest military and military political decision-making body of the NATO Armed Forces. Here you can see him at a reception in Paris. This made him the highest-ranking soldier of the alliance and, after General Adolf Heuss, the second former officer of the former German Wehrmacht to hold this position. General Steinhoff passed away on February 21, 1994, at the age of 80. 3 years after his death, the Fighter Wing 73 stationed in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, now known as Tactical Air Force Wing 73 Steinhoff, was given the traditional name Steinhoff. On January 1, 1971, Günter Roll, the third most successful fighter pilot in the history of aerial warfare and recipient of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, was appointed to succeed him as inspector of the Luftwaffe. Roll, who held the rank of major at the end of the war, flew 621 combat missions and achieved 275 aerial victories while being shot down himself 8 times. In November 1944, he became the commander of the Group Leaders School of the General of Fighter Pilots, whose training program also included flying captured Allied aircraft. After the war, Günter Roll joined the German Air Force as a major on January 1, 1956. At the end of 1958, He was the first German pilot to be licensed for the Starfighter. In 1966/67, as Inspector of Fighter Pilots in the General Air Force Office, and as head of the F-104 Task Force, he, together with General Steinhoff, analyzed the reasons for the numerous starfighter crashes. In 1974, he became the German military representative on the NATO Military Committee in Brussels. At the end of that year in the Federal Republic, Helmut Schmidt had been Chancellor in the Social Liberal Coalition since May, and Georg Leber was Minister of Defense. Rahl had traveled to South Africa for 3 weeks, but under a false name and at the expense of the South African government. He had also met with South African generals for an exchange of ideas in this country, where strict racial segregation, known as apartheid, prevailed. When this trip, which he considered private, was widely publicized by the magazine Stern, which had come into disrepute in 1984 due to the publication of the forged Hitler diaries. Lieutenant General Rahl was on the 1st. October 1974, dismissed by Minister Leber, as he allegedly knew nothing about the trip. And since the SPD had announced that they would boycott the ceremonial military tattoo that General Rahl was entitled to for his farewell, he himself declined it. There are conflicting explanations regarding Rahl's trip and his dismissal. The third most successful fighter pilot of all time, Günter Rahl, died at the age of 91 on October 4, 2009. He was succeeded from April 1, 1974 to September 30, 1978. Lieutenant General Gerhard Limburg, former first lieutenant in the Ground Attack Branch, who also joined the German Air Force in 1956 with this rank, and after several assignments within the Bundeswehr and NATO, he held the position of inspector. After his retirement on October 1, 1978, Friedrich Erich Oeblisser, who ranked 87th and was a recipient of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, became the 6th Inspector of the Air Force. In 1943/44, as a 21-year-old lieutenant, he achieved 117 aerial victories on the Eastern Front within 20 months. In November 1944, he was wounded as a first lieutenant when a Panzerfaust exploded in his hand, putting him out of action for the rest of the war. Oeblisser joined the German Air Force on August 1, 1956, as a captain, and was, among other things, the commander of 2 fighter-bomber wings. After holding a high-ranking NATO position, Oeblisser became the general manager for the development of the Tornado multi-role combat aircraft in 1970 and retired as a lieutenant general in 1983. 2 years earlier, Oeblisser had caused a stir with his statement before the Defense Committee of the German Bundestag when he truthfully testified that, due to the planned cuts in the defense budget, the German Air Force would be less and less able to fully carry out its assigned tasks. As a result, SPD Defense Minister Hans Appel threatened him with dismissal and early retirement for disloyalty. Since Oeblisser himself had previously agreed to 2 reduction proposals made by Inspector General Jürgen Brandt, General Oeblisser passed away on June 5, 2004, at the age of 81. With the recipient of the Oak Leaves with Swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, former Major Gerhard Barkhorn, born in 1919. On January 2, 1956, the second highest-scoring fighter pilot in history joined the German Air Force. Barkhorn had 301 kills in 1,104 combat missions and had himself been shot down 8 times. In May 1944, he was well on his way to becoming the #1 fighter pilot when he was seriously wounded in an air battle. During the 4 months that Barkhorn spent in the hospital, Erich Hartmann was able to surpass him in kills. Barkhorn spent the last weeks of the war on the Western Front, But on the 21st April, he crashed in his Me-262 and later ended up in American captivity. In the German Air Force, he was initially the squadron leader of the 1st Fighter Bomber Squadron of Fighter Bomber Wing 31, and from 1962, its commander. In 1963, he was transferred to the Air Force Test Command. Barkhorn had hoped for the position of Inspector of the Air Force, but was instead only made Chief of Staff of the 4th Tactical Air Fleet of NATO in Central Europe. On September 30, 1975, he retired as a Major General. On January 6, 1983, the 63-year-old retired Major General Gerhard Barkhorn, who was ranked second among the all-time flying aces, was fatally injured together with his wife Crystal in a car accident at the Cologne interchange, for which he was not at fault. Which brings me to the unsurpassed #1 flying ace in history, whose 352 victories will remain unique, the former Luftwaffe Captain Erich Hartmann. He was assigned to the Eastern Front in October 1942 at the age of 20 as a lieutenant. There, Hartmann, who was nicknamed Booby, earned the reputation among the Soviets as the Black Devil of Ukraine, with his Me-109, which was decorated with a black jagged pattern. On 15 different occasions, he defeated 5 or more opponents in a single day. Stalin had placed a bounty of 10,000 rubles on his head. On August 25, 1944, after his 300th Fortemaitur and 301st victory as the 18th. Out of a total of 27, he was awarded the Oak Leaves with swords and diamonds to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Shortly before the end of the war, he was promoted to Major. Today, people would call Booby Hartmann cool, but he was not a macho. That's also why his nickname was Booby. After the surrender, Hartmann handed over his unit to the 90th U.S. Infantry Division, which, along with other officers of his wing, took him on the 14th of May as a prisoner of war to the Soviets. Since Hartmann refused to cooperate with the Soviets in any way, he was repeatedly put in solitary confinement and experienced torture. He also went on hunger strike several times and had to be force-fed. On December 31, 1949, he was sentenced by the Soviets to 20 years in prison on absurd charges. Then, 2 years later, accused as a war criminal and sentenced in a classic Soviet show trial to 25 years of forced labor. At the end of 1955, he was among the last surviving prisoners of war to be released by the Soviet Union and allowed to return to Germany. In January 1997, more than 3 years after his death, Erich Hartmann was rehabilitated by the Chief Military Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation and cleared of all charges brought against him. The office explicitly found that Hartmann had been wrongfully convicted. Hartmann joined the German Air Force in 1956 with his last wartime rank of Major, and from the 6th June 1959 to the 29th May 1962, he was the commander of the newly established Fighter Wing 71, which in 1961 became the 43rd. On the anniversary of the death of Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron, the traditional name Richthofen was bestowed. At first, Hartmann flew the American F-86, whose nose was painted with his distinctive black tulip pattern. But Hartmann also remained true to his reputation as a hothead in the German Air Force. He was one of the few high-ranking officers of the German Air Force who had been handed over to the Soviets in 1945, and for understandable reasons, he had not forgotten it, despite the fact that they were now allies. During the 10 years in Soviet captivity, Hartmann's only son, whom he had never seen, died in 1948 at the age of 3. His attitude toward the, as we would say today, politically correct generals of the Bundeswehr was also nuanced. A former Air Force officer who had been a prisoner of war with him in Russia described it like this: "He has no sense of tact. He talks to them as if they were NKVD officers of the Soviet Ministry of the Interior whose thinking has been led astray by politics." During the Starfighter affair, Hartmann, who had flown the F-104 himself, broke with many of his old comrades. While Generals Steinhoff, Roll, Barkhorn, and others argued that better pilot training was the solution to the problem, Hartmann had sided with General Panicki. As early as 1957, he had advised General Kamhuber, on the right, not to buy the F-104 at all and demanded, "We should not buy an aircraft that we cannot handle." However, with this, Hartmann, who had been promoted to colonel on July 26, 1967, wanted to. He did not want to badmouth the F-104 per se, but merely meant to convey, quote, that a human problem on our side would cause us serious problems. Namely, that our young pilots did not have the experience to switch ad hoc to such a complex weapon system after a dozen years without flying. But with this statement, as far as his further career was concerned, he had sidelined himself. Now, the policy that had been repeatedly used against critics of Massner, the minister, and his military entourage was put into action. First, General Roll on the right, then head of the F-104 task force, denied him. Second from the left, the qualifications to make such a statement. This already left Hartmann isolated among officer circles. Then, behind his back, his former comrades generously praised him as a good pilot, but at the same time branded him as not a good officer. And on September 30, 1975, months before many soldiers of the West German Air Force as well, according to the order from Defense Minister Helmut Schmidt on the 8th. February 1971, as stipulated by the H-Netz decree, looked like this. The world's leading fighter ace, Colonel Erich Hartmann, known as Booby, left the Bundeswehr at his own request. He had only been promoted twice in the 15 years he served in the new Luftwaffe. Many others, former members of the Wehrmacht, with the right party membership or the right attitude, could hardly escape rapid promotions during the years of Reconstruction. Just like the architect of the Innere Führung doctrine, who was appointed captain in 1939, left-leaning Wolfgraf von Bodesen, born in 1907, who, after his general staff training in Berlin, served on General Rommel's staff from March 1941, until, after a few weeks, he was taken prisoner of war by the British for 6 years until 1947 and was promoted to major during that time. On January 30, 1956, Bodesen joined the Bundeswehr as a colonel. On December 30, 1957, he was promoted to brigadier general. On November 1, 1961, to Major General, shown here in the picture, and on the 1st. On September 1, 1963, he was appointed Lieutenant General. Back to Colonel Hartmann. In 1970, the two American writers Trevor J. Constable and Raymond F. Tolliver honored Booby Hartmann with their bestseller, The Blonde Knight of Germany. In 1971, the book was published in Germany under the title Bring Hartmann Down from the Sky, the story of the world's most successful fighter pilot. On September 20, 1993, Colonel Erich Hartmann passed away at the age of 71. In 2016, his former unit, Fighter Wing 71, now Tactical Air Force Wing 71 Richthofen, honored him with a Eurofighter bearing the jagged nose design that was once so feared. Holzbauer.